The Jewish community dates back to the earliest days of Italy. The two communities, the Italian and the Jewish ones, have overlapped in the country for centuries. So for sure, this long relationship has led the culture to really mingle, but also for people to really distinguish this is our stuff and this is the stuff of the Jews. Because, while Jews were at different points in history fairly well integrated, they were still a minority and they were still discriminated against. On the other hand, there were things that came to be identified as Jewish, mostly because they featured ingredients that were very weird for the rest of the locals. So they were the Jewish things.
Welcome to 18 Jewish Foods, Culture and History in kosher bite-sized portions. This podcast tells the stories of iconic Jewish dishes, shedding light on the people who eat them. Here's your host, Joel Haber.
This episode's food has a somewhat confusing name. Pizza Ebraica is not what you typically think of when you think of pizza. It's a type of a bar cookie with lots of nuts and dried fruits inside that is unique to the Jews of Rome. Some of the other identifying features, rather than being made purely with regular flour, it mixes wheat flour with a good percentage of almond flour, and it is often flavored with a bit of slightly sweet white wine. But the word Ebraica means Hebraic or Jewish. Sometimes this food is called by other names, for example, pizza berida, but this is still a Jewish identifier because the word berida comes from the word brit, like in Brit Milah or a bris in English, the Hebrew word for a circumcision. This pastry is often served at circumcision ceremonies in Rome. So what about that name? Sometimes you'll read articles about pizza Ebraica that will begin by saying, it's not really a pizza. And I would just rephrase that slightly and say it's not what you typically think of when you think of pizza. That thin, plate-like bread that has sauce and melted cheese on top. But the word pizza essentially derives from a word meaning pie, not in the apple pie sense of pie. Rather, this is just something large that is dough-based and cut into small pieces. This pizza Ebraica is baked or is created first as a larger loaf and then cut into smaller pieces, much like a modern pizza as you know it is. So this is just as much a pie as pizza is. The most famous name associated with pizza Ebraica is Pasticceria Il Boccione in the Roman Ghetto. And while I have been to the Ghetto, I have not had the pleasure of trying pizza Ebraica. So before I dig into it to explore what it tells us about Jewish culture, I want to get to the interview early in this episode so that we can learn more about this food itself. My guest, Benedetta Guetta, was born in Milano, Italy, of Libyan Jewish descent. In 2009, she co-founded the only Italian Jewish cooking blog called Labna. She has co-authored 2 cookbooks in Italian, and in 2022, she published her first cookbook in English, the award-winning book Cooking alla Giudia. Speaking of this Roman Jewish cookie, if you will, called pizza Ebraica, is there anything that you could say that makes it Jewish? Why is this considered a Jewish cookie?
Well, I would say for starters, because no one else does any such thing. But to dig back into some of the history of this dish is pretty unclear. It has been prepared for, I want to say, almost 2 centuries in the Jewish community of Rome. We know for sure it's been in the bakery locally, the famous Panetteria Boccione, which is where everybody goes to buy it. Before that, according to different sources, people think it's been probably brought during the Spanish Inquisition from the Jews of Spain or Portugal, but we don't have a lot of evidence of this.
Is there any kind of a Spanish or Portuguese Jewish precursor to it that we can see looks similar?
There isn't. However, the combination of ingredients, the idea that you would have this heavy predominance of almond and almond flour combined with raisins, which was a very, very Southern Italian and before Spanish Jewish ingredient, kind of like points in that direction.
So going a little bit broader, throughout the world, we can find foods that in the local dialects are referred to as Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
But there seems to be a lot more in Italy. Do you have any speculation as to why there are so many like this within the Italian community specifically?
Well, first of all, as I've tried to explain in my book, the Jewish community dates back to the earliest days of Italy. The two communities, the Italian and the Jewish ones, have overlapped in the country for centuries. So for sure, this long relationship has led the culture to really mingle, but also for people to really distinguish this is our stuff and this is the stuff of the Jews. Because, while Jews were at different points in history fairly well integrated, they were still a minority and they were still discriminated against. On the other hand, there were things that came to be identified as Jewish, mostly because they featured ingredients that were very weird for the rest of the locals. So they were the Jewish things.
Well, let me actually ask you about, they've lived together for so long together, but there was an inequality of power at the very least. Are you suggesting that by calling it a Jewish food, that was also part of the discrimination, or like, we're not going to eat that, that's the Jewish food, or it's just a way of identifying a difference?
I want to say both ways, because of course everything that is Jewish has been over the centuries perceived as, suspicious or like strange or like possibly culturally inferior, depending on the times when we're looking at it. So I think there is for sure an element of discrimination, but there's also an element of discrimination in the Latin sense of the term of discrimen, of like separating things, only in that almost like descriptive sense.
And going back to the other point you raised about all of these Jewish named foods, the ingredients that are typically identified as Jewish.
Yes.
Do you find that to be a common reason that some of these foods are called Jewish?
Probably. Again, we don't know for sure, but there's for sure a fact that a lot of foods were introduced to Italy by the Jews, or like by the fact that the Jews adopted them the first earlier than the Christians. So when you think about eggplants, obviously, but when you think, for example, also about artichokes, cardoons, fennel, in some regions also pumpkin. These were vegetables that were not especially common among the Christians, and the fact that they were common among the Jews, who in turn actually had learned to cook them from the Arabs. It's not like the Jews had any special insights there. They just were more familiar with those vegetables.
I want to run through just a few of those foods that are named Jewish, and if we can come up with maybe something that might be the reason it's called Jewish. Let's start with perhaps the most famous internationally, which is carciofi alla Giudia, the Jewish fried artichoke.
So, yes, we have theories again of why we call them Jewish. So there were many jobs that were not allowed among the Jews because the Pope prohibited them. A job that many people had to make a living was to sell fried scraps of food in tiny paper bags. That was a very Jewish occupation, selling them.
Trigli alla mosaica.
So trigli alla mosaica, that's an interesting one. Very often in recipe books, it appears that what used to be a Jewish dish, they are often attributed or refer to Jewish people. So there's the things that alla mosaica that would be in the style of Moses, but there's things that would be like, for example, the Rebecca or Giuditta. So references to the Bible are often pointing in our direction.
Caciucco livornese alla Giudia, the fish stew.
So that's a subcategory, I want to say. Caciucco, people think it originally came from Turkey. It's very possible that the real caciucco just had a mixture of all different type of fishes, and the Jews made their own version with kosher fishes. But it could be the reverse way, in that the Jews might have brought the dish from Turkey with their fishes, with the fishes that they were allowed to eat, and then the people of Leghorn having access to all of the other things that are not kosher, they might have had the other fishes.
So the last thing I'll ask you about is more broader, is that Italian Jewish food is having a moment right now. In the span of, I think, 2 years, we had your book come out, we had Silvia Nakamuli's book from England, and we had Leah Koenig's Portico, the Roman Jewish one. What's going on?
I think there is a rediscovery of the minor Jewish communities. There's been for a really long time, the Ashkenazi culture has just been overly dominant in the landscape of Jewish food. Especially in America, I want to say people have mostly been thinking about food as Ashkenazi food. With the expansion of people's interest in general in cooking, like now our horizons have broadened. I think people have come to realize that there is more to Jewish food than Ashkenazi food. So now we're witnessing a rediscovery not only of Italian food specifically, which I'm thrilled about, but also a lot of the other lesser known communities. There have been books published about the food of India, of the Jews of India. There are books about Jews pretty much everywhere. So I think it's just a luxury that we have now, that we have access to more voices and more experiences in print.
Now, as I mentioned, one of the fascinating things to me when I look at food history is how many foods from around the world are called Jewish in their names. Just to throw out some of them, there's a food from Holland called Jodse boterkoek, and it's kind of like a cross between a cake and a cookie made with butter. Similarly, there's a Danish cookie called Jodekager. And I should say, by the way, that if I am mispronouncing any of these names, please forgive me if you actually speak the language. I'm doing the best I can. From Alsace, we encounter choucroute garni, a very popular dish, but there is a special version of it called choucroute garni à la juive, Jewish choucroute garni. A classic Ashkenazi fish dish is carp à la juive, Jewish-style carp, which is served cold in its aspic and its jelly. And from Spain, there is truzas a la judía, which is Jewish-style trout. Interestingly, we can look in a 13th century Arabic language cookbook from Andalusia, which was under Arab rule at the time. And in it, we find 6 separate recipes that explicitly by name are called Jewish. And in America, you can go into any supermarket and you can find kosher dills and Jewish rye bread. In terms of the pickles, they're not saying that these are more kosher than any other pickles. It's simply a way of identifying them as Jewish. Beyond the examples that Benedetta and I discussed from Italy, a few of the other ones are tagliolini freddi all'Ebraica, roschetta all'Ebrei, and polpette alla Giudia. So for starters, what all of these different Jewish-named foods indicate is how Jews have spread literally all over the world. And more importantly, when we did, we integrated into the local communities. If we didn't, they wouldn't notice these foods and give them these names. And yes, these names had to have come from non-Jews. Jews themselves wouldn't call it Jewish style. Rather, it was non-Jews identifying them as different in some way and calling them Jewish. Now, what might have made them Jewish in the eyes of these non-Jews could be a whole host of things. Some of them might show that it's a Jewish version of the food. For example, the choucroute garni à la juive. Choucroute garni is made in Alsace with fresh fermented sauerkraut and all sorts of charcuterie, different types of preserved meats. The classic version will include quite a bit of pork, but choucroute garni à la juive only uses kosher charcuterie, things made with, for example, beef or goose. Some of these might be called Jewish because of the ingredients, as Benedetta and I discussed. For example, some people think that polpette alla Giudia this meatball is called Jewish because it includes tomatoes, another food that Jews were the first to adapt in Italy. Although others suggest that it's called that because it's made with beef rather than pork, so it might really fall into the first category rather than this one. But still, the ingredients help us to identify something as Jewish. Sometimes it's called Jewish because it is uniquely Jewish, such as pizza Ebraica. Other examples are those dishes in the Andalusian cookbook. These were Jewish dishes. Same thing with carp à la juive. That's a uniquely Ashkenazi Jewish food. In other cases, they're called Jewish because we are the ones who introduced them to the wider public. That's how we get the names Jewish rye bread and kosher dills. Finally, there are times when it is unclear how it got the name. The best example of that is the Yotze Butterkuk. We may have some vague guesses, but really we just don't know why this cookie cake is called Jewish. We just know that it is. Now, the pizza Ebraica raises one more separate point. And since this is my only dessert-type food, I wanted to highlight another aspect that connects to Jewish desserts. Pizza Ebraica contains no butter or milk in the recipe, making it a pareve food. Pareve means neither dairy nor meaty, and therefore, according to the laws of kashrut, it can be eaten after a meat meal. Jews typically wait after eating meat before eating dairy. And so if you're going to have a dessert after a meat meal, it needs to be either also meaty or pareve. Many Jewish dessert pastries are pareve for this reason. For example, babka, a very famous Eastern European dessert. Although I should say that I've had ones made with butter and they're incredible, but typically it was pareve. A popular Sephardic cake is pan de España, which is a light cake made with oil and orange juice, but not butter or milk. Now, clearly this is not universal. There are Jewish desserts that are 100% dairy. For example, New York style cheesecake, you can't get much more dairy than that. Black and white cookies typically were made with butter. And the original rugelach, which were made with a crispy cream cheese kind of a crust. But even those typically dairy pastries will sometimes be adapted for meat meals. I've seen examples of flodny, which is a very famous Hungarian Jewish layered pastry that is typically dairy, but I've seen versions of it that included schmaltz instead of the butter. And I will never forget going to my friend Margot's for Thanksgiving one year, and she made a homemade delicious apple pie, and the crust was incredible. And it turns out that she simply replaced the butter that she would normally use in the crust with beef tallow, which is essentially the same as schmaltz, except that it comes from a cow. Other times, some of these classically dairy pastries have transformed into more popular parve versions. The best example of that is the rugelach that are more popular today, that are made with a soft yeast dough that is parve rather than a crispy cream cheese crust. So from pizza Ebraica, this one Jewish named and uniquely Jewish food, we see a lot about the diasporic history of the Jews. And secondarily, we also understand how we always have to consider the kosher laws when we're preparing our foods and when we are planning our menus. That is a very Jewish way of thinking about food. In my next episode, I will be speaking with Helene Jawara Pinier, and we will be discussing adafina. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Got any questions or comments? Please feel free to email me at jewishfoodbook@gmail.com. Please listen, like, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and I would truly appreciate it if you'd share this with other Jewish food lovers. The theme music you hear is Adirhu Revisited by Rebbe Soul. Check him out wherever you stream music. And as always, until next time, I wish you b'tei avon.